The sun over the Arizona territory was not a friend. In the late summer of 1889, it was a judgment. A relentless copper plate hammered flat against the anvil of the sky, radiating a heat that blurred the world into a shimmering, watery lie. Down on the floor of the Copper Mesa Desert, the air itself had weight, a physical presence that pressed against the skin, dry and demanding. The wind was no relief. It came in hot, scouring gusts, shrieking through the brittle arms of saguaros and carrying the sharp, resinous smell of sun-baked creosote. It was a wind that polished stones and flayed skin, a constant, whining reminder of oblivion. The ground was cracked clay and orange dust, populated by things that bit, stung, or stuck. It was a place that demanded everything from a living creature and offered nothing gentle in return. This was where Marigold Tate had been left to die. She was no longer Marigold. She was just Goldie, a name that felt like a bitter joke in this colorless expanse. She was a ruin, propped against a ridge of shale that offered no shade, only a different texture of heat. Her dress, a fine blue broadcloth chosen for a journey, was now a collection of rags. The hem was shredded, the bodice torn at the shoulder where a hand had grabbed it. Dust had worked its way into the very weave of the fabric, turning the blue to a uniform, miserable gray. Her lips were split, two painful cracks in the center that bled sluggishly, the blood drying black the instant it appeared. Her tongue was a dry, swollen thing in her mouth, tasting of nothing but alkali dust and the metallic tang of her own fear. She had been walking, or crawling, for hours, since the sun was high and white. Now it was beginning its long, angry descent, painting the western clouds in hues of blood and rust. Her fingers, raw and scraped, were clenched around the only thing she had left, a silver brooch. It was heavy, shaped like a cluster of desert willow leaves, finely worked. On the back, obscured by her desperate grip, the initials MT were etched in elegant script. It had been a wedding gift, pinned to her traveling suit. Now it was just a piece of metal, a useless anchor. Its owner, the woman it was meant for, had ceased to exist the moment the wagon pulled away. She had stopped screaming his name hours ago. Her throat was a tube of raw, scorched flesh. Now, her thoughts just circled, stupid and slow, like the buzzards she'd seen earlier. The buzzards were gone now. Maybe they knew she wasn't dead yet, and their patience had worn thin. It started as a vibration in the ground, a rhythm felt through the shale against her back before it was a sound. Her dehydrated mind dismissed it. A trick of the heat, a pulse of her own failing heart. But it grew, separating itself from the whine of the wind. It was steady, measured. The sound of a single horse, moving at a walk, conserving energy. Hope was a dangerous, agonizing thing. It hurt more than the thirst. Goldie tried to lift her head, the muscles in her neck screaming in protest. The world swam in a yellow haze. A shape detached itself from the shimmering horizon. A mirage. It had to be. A horse and rider, dark against the molten gold of the setting sun. The rider was tall, or seemed so from this angle. He sat the horse with an easy, permanent stillness, as if he had been forged there. The horse, an ash-gray gelding with a dark mane, stopped a dozen yards away, blowing softly through its nose, sensing the wrongness of the scene. The man wore a plain, sweat-stained hat, its brim pulled low. The dying light was brutal, carving the angles of his face into sharp relief. He had high cheekbones and a jaw that looked as hard as the rock she was leaning on. He was all edges, all plains, as if the desert had worn away anything soft long ago. He was Silas Crowell, though she did not know it. He was the owner of the Thistle Ridge Ranch, a man who understood the desert's hard bargains. He did not speak. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, his boots making almost no sound in the deep dust. He moved with the same deliberate pace as his horse, wasting nothing. He carried a canteen. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes scanning. Goldie saw them under the shadow of the brim. They were not kind eyes, not in the way of townfolk. They were watchful, wary, and possessed a startling clarity. They assessed her in an instant: the torn dress, the split lips, the raw fingers, the silver brooch clutched in her hand. He looked past her, at the empty waste of the dunes, and then back to her. He unhooked the canteen from his belt, uncapped it, and knelt. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask who she was. He simply pressed the metal lip of the canteen against her broken mouth. "Small sips," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rattling in a dry creek bed. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the most profound mercy she had ever known. It stung her throat, made her cough, a dry, barking sound. She obeyed, taking one small, agonizing swallow, and then another. The man's hand was steady. He let her drink 3 swallows before pulling the canteen back. More later. She tried to form words. Her first attempt was just a rasp, a puff of dust. She swallowed, the motion intensely painful. She tried again. "Jasper?" she whispered. The name was a betrayal in itself, a foulness in her mouth. "Jasper Doyle." The man's expression did not change, but a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just understanding, passed through his eyes. He knew the name. Jasper Doyle was a man who moved through Copper Mesa with a polished smile, a quick hand with a drink, and the scent of money-making schemes. A man who seemed too clean for this country. Silas Crowell stood. He walked past her, his gaze on the ground. His eyes missed nothing. The sand told the story. There, nearly erased by the wind, were the deep ruts of a wagon, a light wagon, a buggy, moving fast toward Copper Mesa, and beside the tracks, boot prints. He followed them for 20 yards. 2 sets. One was made by an expensive, narrow boot with a worn heel Jasper's print. The other was broader, heavier, the boot of a man who did harder work. He walked back to her, Jasper Doyle and an accomplice. It was not a crime of passion. It was a plan. Goldie watched him, her mind slowly clearing as the water worked its magic. The sun was touching the horizon now, and the air was taking on a purple, bruised quality. The chill would come fast. Silas unstrapped a heavy wool blanket from the back of his saddle. He shook it out, the sound a dull thump in the immense quiet. He draped it around her shoulders. The wool was rough and smelled of horse, sweat, and something clean, like pine. He didn't touch her more than he had to. It was a gesture of pure, impersonal utility. He was saving a life, the way he might pull a calf from a bog. But his eyes, when she looked up to try and thank him, held something else. They were still wary, but the hardness was tempered by a deep, settled sorrow. He was a man who had seen the bottom of things, who had lost, and who recognized the shape of loss in another. A shadow passed over them, swift and silent. Goldie flinched. High above, a single red-tailed hawk circled on the last of the day's thermals. Its cry, a thin, sharp scream that pierced the air. The shadow swept over the sand, an omen drawn in darkness. The sight of it, the cold finality of the hawk's hunt, broke the last of her control. A dry sob escaped her. "He took everything," she whispered, the words tearing at her raw throat. She wasn't talking about the money, or the small chest of belongings he'd tossed from the wagon before he and the other man drove off. Her hand tightened on the useless brooch. "He took my name, my honor, too." Silas Crowell looked at her for a long moment. The hawk screamed again. Farther away this time. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a gesture of pity. It was an acknowledgement of fact. He had seen the tracks. He had heard the name. He understood what she meant by honor. He turned and gathered the reins of his horse. "We'll get to Thistle Ridge before dark," he said, his voice flat, practical. "It's not far from here." He offered a hand, his glove worn and stained, to pull her to her feet. She took it. Her legs were water. "Then," he said, pulling her up and guiding her toward the patient gray horse. "We'll see." He had lifted her onto the gray gelding, mounting behind her. It was a terrible intimacy, born of pure necessity. Goldie was lightheaded, her body a universe of pain, and she slumped back against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. The wool blanket was a rough cocoon. trapping the heat of his body and her own. She could smell the pine soap from his clothes, mingled with the more potent animal scents of horse and old leather. They moved through the saguaro gap as the sky turned from bruised purple to a deep, star-pricked black. The canyon walls rose up on either side, obsidian giants blotting out the last of the light. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic clop-clop-clop of the horse's hooves on the packed earth trail, and the creak of the saddle leather. Goldie found her own breathing, shallow and ragged, beginning to fall into the same rhythm. Inhale on the beat, exhale on the beat. It was the only thing that kept the panic from swallowing her whole. The horse, the man, the night they were one single moving entity, and she was just cargo. That steady, four-beat rhythm was a waltz. The thought struck her like a physical blow, and suddenly the smell of pine and leather was gone, replaced by beeswax, champagne, and the cloying scent of bay rum. She was in Jasper's arms, at the La Paloma Hotel in Prescott. 2 months ago, the ballroom was a galaxy of kerosene lamps and glittering glass. The fiddle was fast, the piano's keys laughing. Jasper was immaculate in a black frock coat, his smile a white, perfect promise. He spun her, his hand firm on the silk waist of her best dress. "It's all ahead of us. Marigold," he'd murmured, his breath warm on her ear. "The land is waiting. I've seen the assays. There is a river of pure copper running right under that useless rock your father left you. A river, my darling. We'll be kings." He kissed her then, a public, possessory kiss that made the other women sigh. He promised her a ring, a house, a life untouched by hardship. He promised her the world, and she had believed him. The horse stopped, pitching her forward. The sharp pain in her shoulders brought her back. "We're here." Silas Crowell's voice was a flat rumble behind her. She blinked, disoriented. Thistle Ridge was not a palace. It was a long, low house of adobe and dark timber, built to withstand, not to impress. It sat in the protective crook of a low mesa, looking more like a part of the land than something built upon it. Lamplight, warm and yellow, spilled from 2 windows in the open doorway. A figure was silhouetted there, a woman in a skirt and shirt sleeves, her hands on her hips. Silas dismounted, and for a terrifying second, Goldie thought she would fall. But he was there, his hands closing around her waist, lifting her down. Her legs buckled instantly. He caught her, his grip impersonal, and half carried, half dragged her onto the porch. "Nettie," he said, and it was a statement, not a request. "Saints and sinners. Silas," the woman said. Her voice was husky, like sandpaper over velvet. "You find the most interesting strays." She stepped into the light, and Goldie saw a woman perhaps 10 years her senior, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair the color of a raven's wing, piled carelessly on her head. This was Nettie LaRue, and she ran the only saloon in Copper Mesa that poured straight whiskey and offered no other comforts. She was, as Goldie would learn, Silas's oldest friend, and the only person in the territory he trusted. Nettie's sharp gaze took in Goldie's torn dress, her split lips, her raw hands. "Jasper Doyle," Goldie managed to say, the name a fresh wound. Nettie's eyes narrowed. "I figured." She nodded to Silas. "Get her inside. I brought some of my good salve and a bottle of laudanum." She looked back at Goldie. "And news, child, if you're up for it." They sat her in a simple wooden chair by a cold hearth. Silas built a fire while Nettie gently, firmly, cleaned her face with a damp cloth. The salve she applied to Goldie's lips and hands stung, but it was a clean, healing pain. Silas stood by the new fire, his back to them, watching the flames catch. "The news," Nettie said, kneeling in front of Goldie. "You're not going to like it. Jasper Doyle rode into Copper Mesa about 4 hours ago, bold as brass. He went straight to the land office, and then to the telegraph. He just sold something big. The whole saloon is buzzing about it." A cold, sick dread washed over Goldie, colder than the desert night. Sold what he had her dowry, a heavy chest with $200 in coin and her mother's pearls. But that wasn't something big. Not in the way Nettie meant. She was back in her father's study in Tucson, the smell of old books and pipe smoke still lingering, though he'd been gone 6 months. The lawyer, Mr. Prentice, had been kind. There's not much, Miss Tate, just the house, which is mortgaged, and this. He'd pushed a thick vellum envelope across the desk. The deed. A piece of land up near Copper Mesa, Arroyo del Viento. He bought it for the view. I'm afraid it's just red rock and lizards. Worthless, but beautiful. She remembered holding the papers, the weight of them, the elegant, spidery script of her father's signature. She'd brought them with her when she agreed to marry Jasper, when she showed him. He'd laughed. Red rock and lizards. Your father was a poet, my love. He'd taken the deed from her, folding it gently. Let me put this with my important papers. We'll have it framed, to remember his poetic nature. He'd smiled and kissed her, and slid the deed for Arroyo del Viento into his own locked valise, just for safekeeping. Now, in the quiet of Silas Crowell's house, Goldie's hand went to her torn bodice. The silver brooch was still there, clutched tight, her fingers, slick with Nettie's salve, fumbled with it. She had been twisting it in the desert, a nervous, desperate habit. She'd felt something give. It wasn't just a pin. She looked closer in the firelight. One of the leaves was a hinge. The large ruby cabochon in the center was not a ruby at all. It was a catch, cleverly disguised. She worked her fingernail under the edge. It popped open, inside, where a miniature portrait should have been. There was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. It was not the deed. It was a fragment, torn from a larger page. The paper was old, brittle. Drawn in her father's familiar, spiky handwriting was a series of lines. They looked like geological strata. And in the corner, a notation, 18, 24 in surface, V, rich. Her father hadn't been a poet. He'd been a geologist. He hadn't bought the land for the view. The final memory, the one she'd been pushing away, now came back, complete and terrible. The buggy ride. Jasper, so cheerful, pointing out the strange shapes of the saguaros. A picnic, my love, on our new land. He had insisted on loading her small dowry chest into the back of the buggy himself. For safekeeping on the journey, he'd said, using those same damning words. Then the sun growing hot, the buggy stopping in a shallow, rocky wash. Here we are, he'd said. But his eyes weren't on her. They were on the ridge. A man on horseback had ridden out from behind the rocks. A big man, with a tobacco-stained beard. The one who had left the heavy boot prints. Jasper's smile had vanished. He'd stepped down from the buggy. All business. Is it done? He'd asked the man. She signed the transfer this morning. Thought it was a hotel register. The man had grunted. Jasper turned to her. His face was a mask, cold and unfamiliar. He'd grabbed her arm, yanked her from the seat. He'd taken the dowry chest. He'd taken the brooch, her wedding gift, and pinned it roughly back on her dress. A souvenir, he'd sneered. And then he and the other man had gotten into the buggy and driven away, leaving her in the dust, her own screams dying in her throat. A log split in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Goldie looked up. Silas was watching her, his gaze steady. He wasn't looking at her face, but at her hands. She followed his gaze. On the small washstand where Nettie had left the basin, Goldie had dropped her gloves. They were not the delicate kidskin gloves of a lady. They were worn leather, stained from gardening. The stitching on the right index finger thick and clumsy where she had repaired it herself. Just last week. He said nothing, but his eyes met hers. He had seen the gloves. He knew she was not the fragile creature Jasper had assumed. She was not a stranger to work, or to mending what was broken. Goldie stood up, her legs shaking but holding. She walked to the open doorway. The cool night air felt good on her raw skin. She held the silver brooch in one hand and the tiny, torn map fragment in the other. Jasper thought he had taken everything. He thought he had left a broken, helpless woman to die. He had been wrong. He had left a survivor. A cold, clean rage, pure as the desert stars, settled in her heart. He had her money, he had her land, but he had left her with the proof. He had left her with a purpose. "I will get it back," she vowed to herself, the words silent but screaming. "I will get it back. The land, the money, my name. I will get it all back, by the law, and outside it if I must." The next morning, Goldie woke to a world that did not immediately hurt. She was on a simple cot in a small, clean room, tucked under a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of sunlight and lye soap. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was, and the old panic surged, making her sit up, her heart hammering, but the house was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic crackle of a fire. The air was not filled with dust, but with the rich, powerful scent of dark roast coffee and the smoky perfume of burning mesquite. She rose slowly. Her body was a map of new aches, but the searing pain of her thirst and sunburn had dulled to a low, manageable throb. Nettie had left her a clean set of clothes on a wooden chest, a simple cotton shirt and durable twill trousers, clearly belonging to a man, but clean. Goldie washed her face in the basin of cold water, the shock of it clearing her head. She braided her tangled hair with trembling fingers and, feeling more human than she had any right to, followed the smell of the coffee. Silas Crowell was in the main room, standing by the big black cast-iron stove. He was pouring boiling water into the coffee pot, and the aroma intensified, rich and earthy. He glanced up when she entered, his eyes taking in the borrowed clothes, her clean face. He nodded, a gesture that was becoming familiar, and held out a tin mug. "Coffee," he said. "Thank you." Her voice was still a rasp, but the word was clear. She took the mug. It was hot, the heat searing through to her palms, a good, solid pain. The coffee was black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she sighed it, letting the bitterness and warmth chase the last of the chill from her bones. The room, like the man, was built for function. A long wooden table, a few sturdy chairs, a rifle rack by the door, and shelves holding tins and jars. It was a place of work, not comfort. Yet she felt safer here than she had in the silk-upholstered parlor of the La Paloma Hotel. A man came in through the back door, stamping dust from his boots. He was older than Silas, with a sun-cured face and hands like gnarled oak. He stopped when he saw Goldie, his eyes sharp under a grizzled brow. "This is Cole Brannan," Silas said, not turning from the stove. "My foreman. Cole, this is Miss Tate. She'll be staying." Cole Brannan just grunted, but it was not an unkind sound. He looked at Goldie, then at her hands, which were still raw and blistered under Nettie's salve. "Staying means working," he said, his voice a gravel bar. "I can work," Goldie said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "We'll see." Later that morning, after she'd eaten a bowl of oatmeal that was thick and hot, Cole Brannan led her to the shade of the large barn. He held out a length of thick, bristly hemp rope. "If you're going to be on a ranch," he said, "you learn the knots. First one is the bowline. It's the king. Makes a loop that won't slip. Saves a man's life, or a horse's." His calloused fingers moved with a surprising, economical grace, twisting the rope into a loop. "Now you." Goldie's hands were clumsy. The rope was stiff and abrasive, catching on her broken skin. Her first attempt was a useless snarl. "Again," Cole said, his voice devoid of patience, but also of judgment. She tried again, and again. She focused on the pull and twist, the way the end had to pass through the loop. Cole said nothing, just watched. After 10 minutes, her fingers were bleeding lightly. New scratches over old, but she felt the knot suddenly settle, the logic of it clicking into place in her hands. She held it up. Cole tugged it hard. It held. "Aye," he grunted. "You learn. That's something." He looked at her fingers, nimble and scraped. "You've got quick hands. They just ain't tough. They'll get tough." He left her there with a new length of rope, and she spent the next hour tying bowlines, her frustration melting into a quiet, burning focus. The healing came in these small, solid moments. In the afternoon, the low, distressed baa of a calf in pain drew her to a small holding pen. A scrawny creature, all knobby knees and big, terrified eyes, was bleeding. Its mother nowhere in sight. It had been separated from the herd, likely for being too weak. Goldie slipped through the rails. The calf shied, stumbling. "Easy," she murmured, using the same tone she'd used on her father's spooked mare. "I'm not him." She did not know who she meant by him. Maybe Jasper, maybe any man who had ever heard anything. She knelt in the dust and hay, holding out a hand. The calf regarded her, its sides heaving. Slowly, it took one hesitant step, then another. It nudged her hand, its nose wet and velvety. She found herself stroking its broad, downy forehead, right between the eyes. "You're all right," she whispered to it. "You're just scared, but you're safe here." The calf pushed its head into her palm, and Goldie felt a painful crack deep inside her chest. Not a bone, but a piece of armor she had built around her heart. It fell away, and for the first time since the buggy ride, her eyes filled with hot, silent tears. She did not weep for herself, but for the small, warm, living creature in front of her. It was a clean, simple grief, and when it passed, she felt lighter. That evening, the wind came up, a sudden, cold knife edge from the north. Goldie was on the porch, wrapped in her own arms, watching the sky turn a deep, cold violet. The day's work, the simple, mindless tasks Silas and Cole had given her scrubbing a water trough. Stacking wood had left her body tired, but her mind clear. Silas came out of the house, holding a heavy, dark wool jacket. He didn't speak, just stepped behind her and draped it over her shoulders. The wool was thick, and it carried his scent, that same mix of pine soap, leather, and the faint, clean smell of the man himself. As he settled it, his shoulder brushed hers. It was a brief, accidental contact, but a jolt of heat, sharp and surprising, passed between them. It was not a romantic touch, but it was a deeply human one. It was the first touch she'd had since Jasper's brutal grip that was not one of utility. It was a gesture. Goldie pulled the jacket tighter, the warmth of it seeping into her skin. Nettie LaRue rode up just after dark, her horse a fast-moving shadow. She brought a loaf of fresh bread, a small tin of her good salve, and a sharp, clear-eyed strategy. She found Goldie on the porch, Silas standing in the doorway, a silent guardian. "Well," Nettie said, dismounting and handing the bread to Silas, "you look about 50% more human. Child, that's good. Now, the news." She sat on the porch rail. "All business. Jasper's telling everyone you ran off with a gambler and that he bought your useless land as a favor to your father's memory. He's a snake, but a smart one. He's painting himself as the victim." Goldie's hand clenched. "It's lies. Of course it's lies." Nettie snapped. "But lies stick if you let them. You want that land back, you want your money, you get your name back first. He's counting on you being dead or too ashamed to show your face. You need to show him he's wrong. Fast." "How?" Goldie's voice was a whisper. "Law. You mentioned a deed. Did your father's lawyer in Tucson keep a copy?" I think so, Mr. Prentice." "Good. Tomorrow. Silas is going to Copper Mesa for supplies. You're going with him. You're sending a wire to Mr. Prentice. You're telling him to file a copy of that inheritance paper and that tiny map of yours with the territorial court. And you're filing a claim of your own, right in Judge Alma Beach's courthouse. She's a hard woman, Alma, but she's fair. She don't like snakes, and she don't like men who mistreat women. We're going to put your name on the record, solid as a brand, right where Jasper can't erase it." The plan was terrifying. To go back to Copper Mesa, to be seen, but it was also a lifeline. "First my name," Goldie repeated, testing the words. "Then the money." Nettie nodded. "That's the way." Later, lying on the cot, Goldie listened to the new sounds of the night, not the wind or the coyotes, but the sounds of the ranch, the soft chuff of horses in the corral, The occasional tink-tink-tink of the small bells on the lead mare's harness, the creak of the saddle leather hanging in the barn. Her heart, which had been racing with fear, began to slow, falling into the same steady rhythm as the tack. It was the sound of a place that was alive, and ordered, and safe. She must have dozed, because she woke to a different sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping. Shh! She sat up. The lamp in the main room was out, but the moon was bright, casting a silver rectangle through her window. She walked to the open door. Silas was on the porch, sitting on the top step, his back to her. In the moonlight, she could see his hands, a small block of wood in one, a sharp knife in the other. He was whittling. The sound was quiet, patient. She watched as he shaved long, curling strips of pale wood, the shape of something emerging. She stood there for a long time, just watching him work. He knew she was there. She was sure of it, but he didn't turn or speak. He just continued his patient work. Finally, he blew on the wood. Brushing away the last of the shavings, he turned. He held it out to her. It was a bird, a roadrunner, its head up, its long tail fanned, caught in a moment of sharp, intelligent stillness. The lines were clean and simple, but he had caught the very spirit of the creature. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice rough with sleep. She took it. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands. Silas looked out at the moonlit mesas, his profile sharp as the bird he'd carved. "Roadrunners," he said, his voice low. "They're smart. They kill rattlers. They're too fast to be caught and too mean to be eaten." He looked at her then, his eyes clear in the moonlight. "Don't let anyone cage you. Miss Tate. Not ever again." Goldie looked down at the small, fierce bird in her palm. She felt the sting of tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked up at Silas, at his hard, honest face, at the man who had asked for nothing, not even her story, but had given her water and shelter and work. A small, unfamiliar tremor started at the corners of her mouth. It was a smile. It was the first one, and it felt rusty, fragile. Her lips, still healing, trembled with the effort. But the smile reached her eyes, and in her eyes, mixed with the gratitude, a small, hard spark of mesquite fire had just caught light. The trip to Copper Mesa had been a quiet ordeal. Goldie had sat on the wagon bench next to Silas, the wooden roadrunner he had carved held tight in her pocket. She had worn one of his own clean shirts, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, and a wide-brimmed hat he'd given her, pulled low. A few people had looked, their gazes curious and sharp. But Nettie LaRue had met them at the telegraph office, her presence a formidable shield. The wire to Mr. Prentice was sent. The claim was filed at the courthouse, a small, dusty room run by a clerk who looked at her with pity until Judge Alma Beach herself, a woman with a back as straight as a rifle barrel, had come out and reviewed the paper. "A claim is not a deed, Miss Tate," the judge had said, her voice clear. "But it is a fire bell. It lets the world know there is a fire. Let us see who comes running." Back at Thistle Ridge, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Goldie was no longer a guest, but a hand, a very green hand. She mended tack, her quick fingers learning the feel of leather and waxed thread. She learned to tell the difference between a good patch of grazing and alkali flats, and she learned the horses. Silas agreed that if she was to be of any use, let alone fight for her land, she could not be afoot. "You'll ride Juniper," he'd said, nodding to a compact, intelligent-looking mare the color of a dried apricot. "She's got sense, but she's got no patience for fools." The first lesson was in the early morning. So early the sun was just a rumor of pale gray in the east. The air was cold, and a thick wet mist had settled in the yard, swallowing the tops of the cottonwoods and muffling every sound. The world felt private, enclosed. Goldie's breath plumed in front of her. "Hold them like this," Silas said. He stood beside her, his voice low in the quiet. He took the leather reins from her, looping them through his own scarred hands. "Not a death grip. You're not trying to choke her." You're trying to talk to her." He passed them back. Goldie's hands were clumsy. She was nervous. The last time she'd been on a horse, she had been a child. "No," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm. He stepped closer. The mist swirled around them, isolating them in a small circle of damp earth and the warm, hay-scented steam rising from the mare's back. "Your hands are too high, and you're white-knuckling." He put his hand over hers. It was not a touch like the one on the porch. This was different. His hand was large, calloused, and enveloped her own. A jolt went through her, a dry, electric heat that had nothing to do with the cold morning. It was not a romantic touch. It was the touch of a teacher, and yet it was the most profound contact she had ever felt. His warmth did not just cover her skin, it sank into her bones. He adjusted her grip, moving her fingers into the correct, light but firm hold. "Feel that," he murmured. His head was close to hers, his breath a faint, warm cloud beside her ear. "That's the bit. You just want to feel her mouth. A light conversation." Goldie could not speak. She could only nod. She was intensely aware of the rough wool of his jacket sleeve brushing her arm, the way the mist clung to the dark hair at his temples, the solid, living presence of him. He did not seem to feel the strange, sudden current between them. He was focused on the horse, on the reins, on the task. He kept his hand over hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Good. Now, up you go." He held Juniper's head, and Goldie managed to get her foot in the stirrup and swing her leg over. A clumsy, lurching movement in the constricting men's trousers. She settled into the deep seat of the saddle. It felt miles from the ground. "Just walk her," Silas said, stepping back. "Feel her move." Goldie nudged the mare with her heels, and Juniper moved off with a smooth, powerful walk. For a moment, Goldie felt a surge of triumph. She was doing it. She was riding, but a rabbit, spooked by the mist, suddenly darted from under a sagebrush. Juniper didn't bolt. She just shied, a violent sideways leap that was pure, fluid reflex. Goldie was not prepared. She lost her balance, her grip on the reins, and felt herself pitching sideways. A cry of surprise caught in her throat. She never hit the ground. Silas moved with the same shocking speed as the horse. In one stride, he was there, his left hand grabbing the bridle to steady the mare, his right arm locking around Goldie's waist, pulling her from the saddle and against his chest. It was a purely instinctive, protective motion. He was strong, and his grip was iron. Her fall was stopped so abruptly it knocked the wind from her. They froze. Goldie was pressed against him, her face buried in the rough fabric of his jacket, her feet dangling inches from the ground. She could feel the solid, thumping beat of his heart against her ribs. One of her hands was tangled in the front of his shirt, and her braid had come undone, her hair spilling over his shoulder, the ends of it brushing the bare, warm skin of his neck. The world went silent again. The mist, the smell of pine soap and clean sweat, the unsteady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. He held her for 1, 2, 3 long seconds. She could feel the muscles in his arm, hard as new rope. He made a sound, a low noise in his throat, and loosened his grip. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Goldie pulled her head back, her hair catching on a button of his shirt. "Yes," she whispered, her face hot with embarrassment. Yes." Their eyes met. He was so close. She could see the small lines fanning from the corners of his eyes, the exact color of them not just brown, but a deep hazel, flecked with green and gold, like the riverbed. He was looking at her as if he had never truly seen her before. The moment stretched, thin and fragile as a spider's web. Then, slowly, a grin quirked the corner of Silas's mouth. It was a small, rusty expression, as if he hadn't used it in years. "Well," he said, "you're light, but you fall heavy." A bubble of laughter, sudden and unexpected, escaped Goldie's lips. It was a raw, breathless sound, but it was real. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her hands still braced on his shoulders. "Don't be sorry," he said, and his own smile widened, reaching his eyes. He set her down on her feet, but his hands lingered at her waist for a second, steadying her. "Just be ready." The shared laughter, sharp and clean in the cold air, broke the tension. It changed something. It was a bridge between them, built of something stronger than just gratitude and necessity. The quiet, however, did not last. Cole Brannon rode in late that afternoon, his face grim. He'd been checking the northern line, the one that bordered the Arroyo del Viento. He dismounted before his horse even stopped and pulled a piece of rock from his saddlebag. He dropped it on the table where Goldie was mending a bridle. "Found this," he said to Silas. "Up on the ridge of her property. Not just this." He looked at Goldie. "Found powder marks, drill holes. Someone's been blasting. Ma'am, not recently, maybe a year back, but they were looking for ore, and looking hard." The small wooden roadrunner in Goldie's pocket suddenly felt heavy. Her father's map. 18 to 24-inch surface, she said, her voice quiet. Silas picked up the rock. It was shot through with a vein of vivid, unmistakable green. Copper. The next day, the fire bell rang. Deputy Amos Pike rode out from Copper Mesa. He was a young man, earnest and easily flustered, and he clearly did not like being the bearer of bad news. He twisted his hat in his hands as he spoke to Silas and Goldie on the porch. It's just I've got to serve this notice. Miss Tate," he stammered, holding out a paper. "Mr. Doyle, he's filed for an exploratory mining permit on your land." "He can't," Goldie said, her blood running cold. "I filed a claim. I sent the wire." "I know, ma'am, and Judge Beach, she's holding it, but he filed this." He tapped a second, thicker document in his satchel. "He's got a partnership agreement, signed by you, giving him full rights to manage and develop the property. Says you're a full partner. He says you're unwell, and that he's acting in your best interest. It's all legal looking, ma'am, the signature and all. The forgery, the hotel register. The lie was now on paper, filed with the court." After the deputy left, a heavy, cold silence settled on the porch. Jasper wasn't just stealing the land. He was erasing her, painting her as a madwoman, a runaway, while he posed as the dutiful, heartbroken partner. Nettie arrived that evening, riding hard through an unseasonal, driving rain that had turned the ranch yard into a sea of mud. She was soaked, but her eyes were bright with a cold fire. She dismissed Goldie's attempts to get her a towel. "No time. I've got it." She pulled a damp, folded piece of paper from inside her oilskin coat. "This," she said, slapping it on the table, "is what I've been working on for 2 days." It was a list of names. Abraham Peabody, for the engraving shop, $200. Elias Thorne, the assayer, $100. The mercantile, the feed store, even the widow Harris, for her husband's old tools. These are all people Jasper Doyle owes money to. Or, more precisely, people he convinced to invest in his upcoming ventures. He's bled this town, bit by bit, all on the promise of that copper mine. Silas, who had been standing by the window watching the rain lash against the glass, turned. He looked at the list. He looked at the mining permit on the table. He looked at Goldie, who was staring at the list of names, her face pale but her eyes dark. "He's not just a thief," Silas said, his voice quiet. "He's a fool. He's greedy. He's moving too fast, and he's left a trail a blind man could follow." He tapped the list of names. "Here's our proof, or the start of it. He didn't just forge your name. Miss Tate, he's forged a dozen others, in one way or another. We don't just need to prove he's a liar. We need to prove he's a danger to the whole town." He looked at Goldie. "We need allies." Goldie looked at the names. The widow Harris, Mr. Peabody, who had always given her a kind smile. These were not just names. They were people, people he had hurt, just as he had hurt her. She folded her hands, the ones that were now calloused and healing. She took a deep breath, and the smell of the rain, the wet earth, and the mesquite fire filled her. It was the smell of Thistleridge, the smell of home. She bit her lip, a sharp, quick gesture. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "I'm done hiding," she said. "Outside." The rain fell harder. A loose plank on the barn door, one she was meant to fix tomorrow, banged in the wind. Clap, 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 clap. It wasn't a sound of decay. It was a sound of urgency. It was a sound, Goldie thought, like a drum calling for a change. The rain had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The list of Jasper's debts, which Nettie had compiled, lay on the table between them. The paper stiff from its damp journey. It was a catalogue of petty swindles and grand promises. But it was not, in itself, a crime. "It's his word against mine," Goldie said, her voice flat. She traced the name Abraham Peabody with her finger. "He'll say I was a partner. He'll say I was unwell. He'll show them the forged signature." She picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on a scrap of paper, tried to imitate the flourish of her own name. Marigold Tate. The signature on the partnership agreement that Deputy Pike had described was seared into her memory. It was perfect, too perfect. She stopped, the charcoal hovering. "That's it," she whispered, her eyes widening. Silas, cleaning a rifle part by the fire, looked up. "What?" "He never wrote," Goldie said, the memory coming back in a sharp, sudden rush. "Not really. At the hotel, when we had to sign the register, he made a joke. Said his handwriting was for doctors and priests." She looked at Silas, her face pale. "He had a stamp, a brass stamp, with his own signature on it. He used it for everything." "So much more efficient, my love," he said. She stood up, her chair scraping on the wooden floor. "The partnership agreement, the one he brought to me, the one I thought was just a formality. He didn't sign it in front of me. It was already done." Nettie LaRue snapped her fingers. "Peabody," she said, her voice a low growl. "Abraham Peabody, the engraver. That's not a debt on my list. That's a receipt." "You can't go," Silas said, setting the rifle stock down. He was on his feet, his shadow falling across Goldie. "The town is his. He's been poisoning that well for weeks. If he sees you—" "He won't be looking for me," Goldie said, her voice hardening. She was already rolling down the sleeves of the borrowed shirt. "He's looking for a victim, a ghost. He won't recognize me." "She's right," Nettie said, pulling her oilskin coat back on. "And besides, Peabody is a mouse. He'll bolt from you. Silas, he needs a gentler touch." She grinned, a sharp, humorless expression. "And he owes me 3 months' worth of saloon credit. He'll talk to me." Peabody's engraving and printing was a narrow shop tucked between the mercantile and the assayer's office, smelling of chemical acids, ink, and metal dust. Abraham Peabody himself was a small, anxious man with ink stains on his cuffs and spectacles so thick they made his eyes look like 2 frightened, magnified oysters. He was polishing a brass nameplate when they entered, and he nearly dropped it when he saw Nettie. "Nettie!" he stammered, his eyes darting to Goldie, who stood by the door, her hat pulled low, her face in shadow. I was just coming by to settle." "Save it, Abraham," Nettie said, walking past the counter and into the back room, forcing him to scuttle after her. "I'm not here for the whiskey money. I'm here for the truth." Goldie followed, her eyes scanning the shop. Shelves of zinc plates, brass stamps, heavy vellum paper, the tools of legitimacy. What truth?" Peabody squeaked, wringing his ink-stained hands. Nettie pointed to the receipt book on his desk. "The job you did for Jasper Doyle." Peabody turned a shade of gray that matched the zinc plates. I do a lot of work. Mr. Doyle is a very good customer." "I'm not talking about his letterhead," Nettie said. "I'm talking about a signature, a brass stamp. For a Miss Marigold Tate." The man visibly deflated. "He said it was for her," he whispered, his eyes on the floor. "She was his partner. He said she had a tremor, that she couldn't sign for herself. He said it was a kindness. so she could still conduct her business. He was so concerned for her. When, Goldie's voice, low and clear from the shadows, made Peabody jump. 3 weeks ago, just after he got back from Prescott. And who paid for this job? Abraham. Nettie pressed, leaning in. A man, not Mr. Doyle, a big man, wore a brown hat, paid in cash, said it was on Mr. Doyle's account. He was trembling now. He signed the invoice, J.D. Goldie stepped into the light. Peabody's jaw dropped. He had seen her in town, on Jasper's arm. He was looking at a ghost. I need to see the plate, Goldie said, her voice level. And the invoice, I can't. It's client property. He paid for the stamp. Abraham, Goldie said, her voice dropping, taking on a new, hard edge. He didn't pay for the master plate. You keep those. I know you do. And he didn't pay for the invoice book. Peabody, trapped between the ghost in front of him and the living devil who owed him money, made his choice. He fumbled under the counter and pulled out a heavy ledger, and from a flat file, a thin, greased zinc plate. There it was. Marigold Tate. Her own name, cut backward in perfect, elegant script. It was a violation, a physical, metallic theft of her identity. Goldie took out a small pencil and the notebook she'd started keeping. She did not take the evidence. She copied it. Her hands were steady. She wrote down the serial number etched into the side of the plate. She noted the manufacturer's mark. She turned to the invoice book and copied the date August 22nd, 1889. She copied the item description. She copied the tax stamp number glued to the page, and she copied the initials. J.D., scrawled in the signature line. They were small things. A string of numbers. A date. 2 letters. They were tiny, sharp-edged, and rooted in fact. They were not a story. They were not a lie. They were cactus spines. While Goldie was in town, Cole Brannon was getting restless. He and Silas were in the barn, Cole sharpening a shovel with a file, the shing, shing, shing setting Silas's teeth on edge. That deputy ain't going to do it, Cole said, not looking up. And the judge, she's fair, but she's slow. By the time she moves, Doyle will be in San Francisco, drinking champagne, and that land will be owned by a man in a New York bank. We need the paper he filed, Silas said, rubbing the back of his neck. The one Pike saw. The partnership agreement. Aye, Cole said. And I know where it is. He stopped filing. Slocum. Silas nodded. Slocum was Jasper's lawyer, a man whose love for whiskey was matched only by his love for a crooked dollar. His office was above Nettie's saloon. He goes to the table at 7. Cole said, every night, leaves at midnight. He's predictable. It's a risk, Cole. It's less of a risk than sitting here, boss. That night, Cole Brannon did not sneak. He walked. He moved through the back alley of Copper Mesa like a shadow, climbed the rickety stairs to Slocum's office, and listened. He heard the click-clack of poker chips from the saloon below. He took a thin piece of wire from his hatband. The lock was cheap. It took him less than 10 seconds. The office was a mess, smelling of stale whiskey, old paper, and unemptied spittoons. Cole moved with purpose. Slocum was a drunk, but he was also vain. He would keep his most important client's papers close. Not in the file cabinet. In the new, expensive leather valise sitting by the desk, ready for a journey. Cole opened it. It was full of documents, plats, assays, and on top, a thick vellum document tied with a red ribbon, Agreement of Exploratory Rights Partnership, Doyle Tate. He untied the ribbon. He didn't read the legal language. He went to the last page. There it was. Marigold Tate. The signature was perfect. A flawless black flourish. Cole leaned in. He sniffed the paper, and he smiled. He pulled a small match from his vest, struck it, and held it close to the signature. The ink was shiny. It had not been blotted. It had been pressed. And the smell, in the small, sulphurous light of the match, it was not the nutty, metallic smell of old iron gall ink. It was sharp, chemical, the smell of Mr. Peabody's back room. The ink was new. He didn't take the document. He just retied the ribbon, put the valise back, and left, locking the door behind him. The next day, Deputy Amos Pike, his face pale with sweat, stood before Judge Alma Beach in her chambers. Silas, Goldie, Nettie, and Cole stood with him. The judge, her steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, looked at the evidence on her desk. Goldie's notebook with the copied invoice details. Cole's sworn testimony about the valise and the fresh ink. "A stamp is not a signature, Mr. Crowell," she said, peering at them over her glasses. "And fresh ink on a claim of partnership is a confession. To a very small room, it's not enough. He will say she gave him the stamp. He will say he just had the document re-inked by his lawyer. A jury might believe him. I need a witness who saw the forgery happen, and I need a clear motive. Why the rush? Why not just wait?" Silas, who had been staring at the territorial map on her wall, finally spoke. "The railroad," he said, his voice quiet. Everyone looked at him. "The Trans-Arizona line," Silas said, tapping the map. "I saw their surveyors last month, up by the North Pass. They're coming through. They're buying up every claim they can. They need copper, miles of it, for the new telegraph lines." The pieces clicked into place, sharp and terrible. "He's not a miner," Goldie said, understanding. "He's a promoter. He found my father's blast marks. He knew the copper was there, and shallow, he faked the deed, not to mine it, but to sell it. He's selling a piece of paper," Silas finished, his eyes meeting hers. "He has to sell it fast, to the railroad, before they send their own geologist and find out the vein is rich, but small. He's not selling a mine. He's selling a rumor, and he needs to do it before your claim, Miss Tate, scares the buyers off." Goldie looked at her allies. Nettie, with her fierce loyalty. Cole, with his quiet competence. Silas, with his steady, unshakable presence. She looked down at her hands, still clasped around her small, vital notebook. They were shaking, not from fear, from a cold, clean rage that burned all the way down to her bones. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. It was the calmest, most dangerous sound in the room. "He left me in the desert to die. He thought the sun would be his accomplice. He thought I would be a silent, nameless body, buried in the sand." She looked at the judge. "He's a promoter. He wants an audience. He's going to announce his big sale, his new partnership with the railroad. As a triumph, he wants to be the king of Copper Mesa." "The cattle auction," Nettie said, her eyes gleaming. "It's next week, the biggest day of the year. The railroad buyers, the bankers, everyone will be there. That's his stage." "Then that's where we'll set the trap," Silas said. "We'll let him build his stage, and we'll pull it right out from under him." The week before the cattle auction was not a week. It was a countdown. Each day a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. The quiet, healing rhythm of the ranch was replaced by a taut, thrumming tension, the hum of a wire pulled tight. "You are not doing this," Silas said, his voice flat. He was standing in the dry wash behind the barn, the sun just beginning to cut through the morning chill. He held a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel a dull, heavy blue. "You're not going to stop me." Goldie said she was not asking. "I am not," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm going to teach you." He broke open the gate, showed her the empty chambers, and then snapped it shut. "This is not a toy." "It is not a threat. It is a tool, and it is the last tool you use. You understand?" "I understand," she said, her voice steady. He handed it to her, butt first. The weight of it was shocking. It was a solid, dense, metal thing, a piece of pure, cold purpose. Her hand, even with the new calluses, was dwarfed by it. Not like that. He stepped up behind her, close enough for her to feel the heat from his body in the cool air. "You're holding it like you're afraid of it. Don't be afraid. Respect it." He adjusted her grip, wrapping his own large hand over hers, folding her fingers into place. "Both hands. You're not a gunfighter in a dime novel." He moved her hands, one on the grip, the other cupping the underside of her fist. Stance, shoulder width, Lean into it. He put his hand on her shoulder, a light pressure that squared her to the target. A rusting tin can on a fence post 50 feet away. We'll start with blanks, he said. The noise is the first thing. The kick is the second. You need to be ready for both. He loaded a single blank cartridge. Now, raise, sight down the barrel. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Slow. She raised the heavy gun. It wavered. Her arms burned. Your wrist is locking, he said, his voice a low rumble by her ear. He placed his left hand, the one that wasn't holding his own rifle, on her right wrist. His palm was calloused and warm, and it covered her entire forearm. His touch was not gentle, but it was incredibly steady. It was a transfer of energy. Breathe out, he said. Don't hold your breath, and don't fight the gun. Let your arm rock with it. It's not about strength, Miss Tate. It's about being stable. The touch of his hand on her wrist was an anchor. She squeezed. The click-wham of the blank was deafening in the enclosed wash. It was a sound far bigger than the gun. A violent, shocking bark. Goldie flinched, her eyes slamming shut. Again, he said, reloading. His hand was still on her arm. A solid, living brace. Eyes open. She fired. And again. And again. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the air. With each shot, she flinched less. His hand remained, not holding her up, but simply there, connecting her to the earth. Good, he said, finally stepping back. The space he'd left feeling suddenly cold. You're steady. Now we'll see if you can hit anything. While Goldie learned the feel of cold steel, Nettie LaRue waged a war of whispers. She moved through Copper Mesa with a ledger book and a sharp, sympathetic ear. She collected her allies not with promises, but with shared grievance. She sat with the 3 other saloon keepers, men who despised Jasper's fancy Eastern manners and his unpaid tabs. He brings in strangers, she told them, over a glass of her own good whiskey. Men who don't spend. He's bad for business. He's bad for this town. They gave her their sworn statements. Yes, they'd seen him, writing at a back table, sealing letters with his own stamp, posting them himself. She found the post office clerk, a nervous young man named Finnerty, sweeping the boardwalk. He was sending letters to himself. Finnerty, Nettie said, her voice kind. From a woman, a Miss Tate, but he was also mailing letters as Miss Tate. Did you see that? Finnerty paled. I'm not supposed to look at the mail, ma'am. But you're a smart boy. You notice things. You noticed him, didn't you? Using that fancy stamp of his. He gave me $1, ma'am, Finnerty whispered. For looking the other way. For putting her mail aside for him. Write that down, Nettie said, her voice still kind, but with an edge of iron. Write it all down, and I'll make sure Judge Beach knows you're an honest boy who made one mistake, instead of a fool who helped a thief. Finnerty wrote it down. Cole Brannon's trap was quieter and sharper. He went to Peabody's, his hat in his hand. Mr. Peabody, he said, his voice mild. That stamp, the M. Tate 1, Mr. Doyle is worried the original might have been flawed. He wants a new one made. Just the same. Peabody, terrified of everyone, wrung his hands. I can't, But, Cole said, he'd be mighty grateful. He sent this. He put a $5 coin on the counter. And he'd need a receipt. Peabody looked at the coin. He looked at Cole. He made the new stamp. He wrote the receipt. Paid in full. For one duplicate M. Tate signature stamp. By order of J. Doyle. Cole pocketed the receipt and the new stamp. There's one more thing, he said. Mr. Doyle has a package. He needs it picked up. But he's busy. He's sending his associate, the big man, Brown Hat. He and Peabody drafted a telegram, a fake, and put it in a bait envelope. They left it at the telegraph office with instructions for it to be held for J.D. Key's associate. They just had to wait for the man in the brown hat to come and claim it. The legal machine was turning. Judge Beach, armed with Nettie's witness statements and Cole's new receipt, held a tense meeting in her chambers. "It's a strong case for fraud," she said. Her fingers steepled. "But he will run, Mr. Crowell. The second he is publicly accused, he will run." "I know," Silas said. "And you'll go after him," she stated. It was not a question. "I will." "Then I am deputizing you," she said, shocking everyone. "And you, Mr. Brannon, for the day of the auction only." She looked at Deputy Pike. "Amos, you will have a warrant, not for arrest, for detainment pending a public hearing. We will give Mr. Doyle his stage, just as he wishes. I will convene a temporary territorial hearing, right there on the auction platform. We will settle the matter of the Arroyo del Viento claim, in front of God and all his buyers." Silas spent that night not in his bed, but in the barn. Goldie, unable to sleep, found him there. He was not mending tack. He was working on his best saddle, the one he used for long-range pursuits, rubbing oil into the leather with a soft cloth. His fastest horse, a lean, rangy chestnut, was in the next stall, already brushed and fed. He was preparing for a chase. Goldie returned to the house. To the main room. The fire was low. She lit a new lamp, pulled a fresh sheet of paper from Silas's ledger, and dipped his pen in the ink. She began to write. She did not write a letter. She wrote a history. She wrote a statement. Her handwriting. The real one. Clear and steady. "My name is Marigold Tate." She wrote about the promises at the La Paloma. She wrote about the deed for Arroyo del Viento. She wrote about the faked signature on the hotel register. She wrote about the buggy ride and the man with the tobacco-stained beard. She wrote the name Jasper Doyle, and she wrote the exact, terrible truth. "He took my dowry, he took my deed, and he left me on the Copper Mesa Desert, miles from any water, to die. He did this on the morning of August 28th, 1889. She wrote it all down. Every word was a nail, hammering the truth into the paper. When she was done, she signed it, Marigold Tate. She did not feel fear. She felt light. She had taken the story out of her head, where it was a nightmare, and put it on the paper, where it was evidence. The night before the auction, the four of them sat by the fire. Nettie, Silas, Cole, and Goldie. They were a small, tired-looking army. "He'll have men," Cole said quietly, staring into the flames. "The buyers, and that brute in the brown hat, will have the truth," Nettie said, "and the law. And if that fails—" She patted the small derringer hidden in her sleeve. Silas said nothing. He just watched Goldie, who was holding her affidavit in her hands, her knuckles white. "It's time," she said. Far off, on the ridge that overlooked the ranch, a man sat on his horse, a dark shape against the rising moon. He wore a brown hat, and his beard was stained with tobacco. He'd been watching the ranch for 2 days. He'd seen the woman, the one who was supposed to be dead, practicing with a pistol. He'd seen the judge's deputy ride out. He'd seen Silas Crowell preparing his fastest horse. He did not know what it all meant, but he knew his boss, Jasper Doyle, would not be pleased. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He turned his horse and spurred it hard, back toward Copper Mesa. He had a report to make. The ranch was silent, but it was not asleep. It was a silence that held its breath. The night had turned cold, and a fine, persistent drizzle was falling. A mist so light it seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. It coated every surface with a slick, cold sheen. On the porch, the wooden planks were dark and damp. The single kerosene lamp hanging from a beam cast a weak, yellow circle, its flame trembling with every errant gust of wind, making the shadows shift and leap like a nervous heart. The air smelled of wet dust, damp wood, and the iron-gray scent of the approaching storm. Goldie was in the circle of light, but she felt cold to the bone. She had been standing there for an hour, unable to sit, unable to think of sleep. In her hand, she held the affidavit she had written, the paper a stark white rectangle in the gloom. It felt like the heaviest thing she had ever held, heavier than the peacemaker, heavier than the dowry chest Jasper had stolen. It was her entire life, her entire shame, condensed to 2 pages. She heard the soft creak of the floorboard inside, but she didn't turn. She knew his step. Silas emerged from the darkness of the house, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He wore no hat, and the fine mist was already glistening in his dark hair. He did not come to stand beside her, but stopped by the door, just watching. He said nothing. He simply waited, giving the silence to her. Finally, she spoke, her voice so low it was almost lost to the whisper of the rain. "I'm afraid." She had not meant to say it. She had practiced her testimony. She had practiced with the gun. She had practiced being strong. But the admission, once loosed, hung in the air between them. He still did not speak, but she felt his gaze, steady and patient. "Not of the hearing," she continued, her voice gaining a small, brittle edge. "Not of the men, not even of him, of what he might do." She turned to face him then, and the lantern light caught the sudden, desperate sheen in her eyes. It was not just the rain. "I'm afraid of his laugh." Her voice cracked on the last word, a sound of old, deep shame. "You don't understand. When he tricked me, he laughed. This quiet, amused sound, like I was a fool. Like I was a child he had just bested in a game. I can hear it. I'm afraid I will walk onto that platform, and he will look at me, and he will smile. And all the words will go. I'll just be that fool, the one he left in the desert." Her shoulders were shaking, not just from the cold. She was crying, silent, angry tears that mixed with the mist on her face. Silas looked at her, at this woman who had survived the desert, who had learned to tie knots with bleeding fingers, who had held a pistol and not flinched. And he saw a pain far deeper than any of those things. He saw the wound that shame leaves, the one that never seems to heal. He was a dozen feet from her. He was a man of action, not words. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut, that no promise, no reassurance he could speak would touch this kind of fear. So he moved. He took one slow step, then another. He closed the distance by half, putting himself in the full, weak circle of the lamplight with her. And then he stopped. He did not reach for her. He did not offer a hand. He just stood there, his own hands loose at his sides. He had crossed his own territory. The last few feet, the space that separated them, was hers. The choice was hers. Goldie looked at him, at his stillness. He was not offering pity. He was not offering to fight her battles. He was just there, solid as the mesas, and just as quiet. He was offering a place to stand. She took a sharp, ragged breath. It was the hardest step she had ever taken, harder than walking out of the desert. She moved, closing the final gap between them. She stopped an inch from his chest. She was trembling. She could feel the solid heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the damp cold clinging to her own clothes. Her chest was tight, her breathing shallow and fast, slowly, as if her hand had its own will. She lifted it. She didn't touch his face. She didn't grab his arm. She laid her palm flat against his chest, over the solid bone and muscle that shielded his heart. She felt it, under the rough cotton of his shirt, a steady, strong thump, thump. It was not fast. It was not nervous. It was the rhythm of the ranch. It was the rhythm of the man. It was real. The breath she had been holding escaped in a long, shuddering sigh. Their eyes were locked. He was so close. She was breathing the air he had just exhaled. He lifted his hand, moving with the same deliberate slowness he used on a spooked horse. She saw the motion. She had time to pull away, but she stayed. His fingers were not soft. They were calloused and rough from leather and rope and metal. But his touch was the gentlest thing she had ever known. He laid his palm against the side of her face, his fingers threading into her damp hair by her temple. His thumb, large and slightly rough, moved, streaking across her cheekbone, wiping away a single tear. At his touch, The last of her rigid control dissolved. It was too much. The kindness, the safety. It was a thing she had not known she was starving for. Her eyes fluttered and closed. She leaned into his palm, a small, involuntary movement. And then, in a gesture of pure, unthinking trust, she rested her forehead against his. His skin was warm. He smelled of pine soap and wet wool. He held still, letting her have that. He just breathed. Then he lowered his own head, his forehead still pressed to hers, until his mouth was level with hers. The kiss was not a surprise. It felt, in that moment, like the only inevitable thing in the world. It did not start. It arrived. His lips, dry and warm, brushed hers. It was a question. Soft, patient. She answered. Her own lips, still healing, softened under his. She breathed out, a small, quiet sound. And that was all the answer he needed. He tilted his head, a small, perfect adjustment, and kissed her. It was not the hungry, possessory kiss of Jasper. It was not a kiss of passion, not in the way the world meant. It was a kiss of profound, staggering comfort. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a kiss that said, I am here. I am not leaving. You are safe. It was a kiss that tasted of the cold night air and a deep, surprising warmth. The affidavit slipped from her fingers, forgotten, fluttering to the damp porch boards. Her shoulders, which she had held rigid for weeks, finally slumped. The tension drained out of her, leaving her weak-kneed. Her hands, which had been braced on his chest, slid up. Her arms went around his back, under his heavy jacket, her fingers clutching the worn fabric of his shirt. She pulled him closer, not in passion, but in a desperate, fundamental need to be held, to be anchored. She was not falling. She was being held up. A sudden, sharp meow cut through the night. The calico barn cat, hunting in the drizzle, had come to the porch to complain. They did not jump apart. The kiss did not break, so much as it dissolved. They pulled back, slowly, just enough to breathe. Laughter, small and breathy, bubbled up from both of them at the same time. A shared, secret sound. His forehead came to rest against hers again. She could feel his smile against her skin. Tomorrow, he whispered, his voice a low, rough vibration that she felt in her bones. You are not alone. She did not answer. She could not. She just turned her head, burying her face in the warm, rough curve of his neck, and held on. She closed her eyes and just existed. She leaned her full weight against him, and he took it. He did not shift. He did not waver. His arms, which had been at his sides, came up and folded around her, holding her securely, his hands resting on the small of her back. She stood there for a long time, held in the circle of his arms, listening. The rain whispered, the lamp flame guttered, and under her ear, the steady, reliable beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a horse at a steady walk on wet earth, a sound that meant you were not lost, a sound that meant you were going home. Her courage, which she had thought was a hard, angry thing, was not. It was this quiet, warm, and steady thing. Finally, so slowly, they pulled apart, just enough to look at each other. The dampness was on both their faces, the rain in their hair. The lamplight was kind. He looked at her, and the loneliness that always lived in the back of his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, protective fire. She looked at him, and the fear, the old, cringing shame, was gone. Her eyes were clear. They were not hard. They were not soft. They were steady. And in them, a small, stubborn spark had finally, truly, caught flame. It was not a blaze. It was a hot, enduring ember. And it would not be going out. Copper Mesa's central square was a choked river of humanity, a noisy, dusty mess that smelled of cattle, fresh manure, beer, and sweat. It was the day of the annual territorial cattle auction, and everyone who was anyone and plenty who were not was there. Ranchers in their Sunday best, buyers from as far east as Kansas City, speculators with shiny boots, and the local townsfolk, all milled and shouted, the air thick with the auctioneer's fast, rhythmic chant. On the north side of the square, the permanent wooden auction stage had been commandeered. The auctioneer had been temporarily displaced, his platform now occupied by a simple pine table and 3 chairs. A bewildered Deputy Amos Pike, his badge polished to a nervous gleam, stood on one side, on the other. Judge Alma Beach sat, straight-backed and formidable, her gaze sweeping over the rowdy crowd with an expression that brooked no argument. A heavy gavel, usually reserved for her courtroom, sat on the table. She had, in effect, created a pocket of law in the middle of chaos. Jasper Doyle made his entrance just before 10 o'clock, as the bidding on the first prize bull was heating up. He was not subtle. He rode a tall black gelding with a silver concho saddle, and he wore his finest black frock coat. Pinned to his lapel was a bright yellow desert marigold, a stunning, arrogant piece of theater. He dismounted, handing his reins to a boy with a flip of a coin, and moved through the crowd like a ship through water. He smiled, he nodded. He shook the hands of the railroad men, his teeth a white flash in his handsome face. His smile was a greasy, well-oiled blade. He was a man at the peak of his power, the king of his own story, ready to announce his triumph. Then, a different kind of quiet fell. Just a small pocket of it, over by the courthouse. The crowd parted, this time with a different, more curious murmur. Goldie Tate walked through the opening. She was not the ghost he had left in the desert. She was not the fine lady he had courted. She wore a simple, clean dress of blue cotton, one Nettie had provided. Her hair was neatly braided and pinned. The only spot of color was a small silk scarf, the color of turquoise, tied at her throat. It was the color of her father's worthless land. She looked clean and poor, and absolutely, terrifyingly real. And she was not alone. One step behind her, just to her right, walked Silas Crowell. He wore no jacket, just a clean shirt and his work trousers, his gun belt strapped low. He was not there as a gentleman. He was there as a fact, a solid wall of purpose. His eyes, under the brim of his hat, never left the square, but they were not on Jasper. They were on everyone else. He was a silent, living warning. Goldie did not look at Jasper. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Judge Beach, and she walked, her head high, straight to the platform. Silas stopped at the base of the steps, folding his arms. He had been deputized. He was the barrier. Judge Beach slammed the gavel. The loud, sharp crack cut through the auctioneer's drone, silencing the square in a wave of shocked curiosity. "This court," she announced, her voice carrying over the surprised faces, "is now in session, by authority of the Arizona Territory, to hear a public claim filed by Miss Marigold Tate concerning the land known as Arroyo del Viento." Jasper, who'd been laughing with a railroad buyer, froze. His smile went rigid. He turned, his eyes finding Goldie on the stage. For a single, flickering instant, his mask of charm slipped. He looked at a dead woman. The shock was real, but he recovered in a heartbeat, his face rearranging itself into a mask of tragic concern. He began to walk forward, his hands spread in a gesture of pained confusion. "Marigold, my dear, what is this? We thought you were lost." "The court will hear from Miss Nettie LaRue," Judge Beach said, ignoring him. Nettie stepped up, holding a ledger. "I am not a witness. Your Honor, I just call the ones who are. I call Abraham Peabody." Peabody, clutching his own invoice book, looked like he was about to faint. He stumbled up the steps, guided by a sharp look from Nettie. "Mr. Peabody," the judge said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Your book, please. Read the entry for August 22nd of this year." Peabody put on his thick glasses. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the page. Yes, Your Honor, that's one brass signature stamp, custom, for Marigold Tate. Cost of $5, paid in full." "And who paid?" "Mr. Peabody." Peabody swallowed. "A man Ma'am, not Mr. Doyle. A big man, in a brown hat. He signed the invoice. How did he sign it? Just J.D., ma'am. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was better than a cattle auction. Jasper's face darkened, the mask of concern slipping into one of irritation. This is absurd. This is a private matter between partners. I had the stamp made for her convenience. She was not well. The court calls Cole Brannan. Judge Beach said. Cole mounted the steps. He held a single, crisp piece of paper. Your Honor, this is the partnership agreement, Mr. Doyle filed with the land office. The one Mr. Slocum, his lawyer, was holding for him. How did you get that? Mr. Brannan. Mr. Slocum is a careless man, Your Honor. Jasper lunged. Objection, that's stolen. Duly noted, Mr. Doyle, the judge said dryly. Mr. Brannan, your point. Cole held the paper up to the crowd. My point is, I know ink. And this signature, this Marigold Tate. He tapped the paper. It was made with that stamp, and it was made less than a week ago. I can still smell the chemicals in it. It's fresh. And it's a forgery, came a new voice. Deputy Pike, finding his courage, stepped forward. He held up Goldie's 2-page affidavit, the one she had written in her own hand. And this is her real writing. I'm no expert, ma'am, but they ain't even close. He held the affidavit next to Cole's paper. The crowd surged forward to see. The scrawled, desperate-looking stamp signature and the clean, steady script of Goldie's hand were two different worlds. The murmur was louder now, angry. She lies, Jasper shouted, his face finally turning red, the mask gone. This is a conspiracy. She ran off, and now she's come back to extort me. I have a contract, a binding partnership agreement, signed and sealed. He tore a document from his own coat pocket, a fresh, clean copy, and waved it. Here's the paper signed by her. It is legal, it is binding. Let me see it, Goldie said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear as a bell. It cut through his shouting, and the square went dead silent. Jasper, triumphant, seeing his opening, strode to the platform. He smiled his oily smile. Of course, my dear. He handed it to her, as if to a child. Perhaps you've simply forgotten you signed it. Goldie took the heavy vellum paper. She did not look at the front. She did not look at the signature. The crowd held its breath. Silas, at the bottom of the steps, uncrossed his arms, with a single, deliberate motion. Goldie turned the paper over. He's a very meticulous man, she said, her voice still quiet, projecting to the silent crowd. He's also a vain one. He wanted the forgery to look perfect, so he had Mr. Peabody use the best, newest brass plate. She held the paper up, showing the back of the last page. He pressed so hard, she said, that the stamp left an impression, a deep one. She ran her finger along a faint, raised set of numbers on the back of the page. Mr. Peabody, your master plates. They have serial numbers, do they not, for your inventory? Peabody, his eyes wide, nodded. Like this one? Goldie asked. Number A472. Peabody squinted. He nodded, his voice a squeak. That's the one, the Tate plate. Jasper tried to scrape the mark off the paper, Goldie said, turning to the crowd, her voice finally rising, ringing with a cold, clear power. But he failed. The truth always leaves a mark. This isn't a partnership. It's a bill of sale. He sold me, and he left me in the desert to die. The crowd exploded. Fraud, shouted one of the saloon keepers. He's a thief, yelled the widow Harris. Judge Beach slammed the gavel. Crack, crack, crack. This court finds this document, she yelled, pointing at the paper in Goldie's hand. To be a fraudulent instrument, the claim of Marigold Tate on Arroyo del Viento is recognized by this court, Deputy Pike. Detain Mr. Doyle. It happened so fast. Jasper's eyes, wide with panic, darted to the crowd, to the angry faces, to the judge, and then to his horse, standing 20 feet away. He didn't wait for Pike. He vaulted off the side of the platform, shoving Nettie aside. He drew a small derringer from his boot. A flash of silver. He didn't aim at anyone. He fired into the air. The crowd screamed and fell back, creating a path. "Get him!" Silas roared. And he was already moving, his deputized status forgotten, his only thought the chase. He launched himself toward his own chestnut, the horse he had kept ready. Jasper scrambled into his saddle, raking his spurs into the black gelding's flanks. The horse leaped forward, scattering people. Silas was a heartbeat behind, swinging into his own saddle in a single, fluid motion. The crowd parted for him like the sea. For a second, Goldie just stood there, the worthless, damning paper clutched in her hand. Then she saw the man in the brown hat, the accomplice, near the edge of the square, already mounted, turning to ride and help his boss. She looked at Juniper, Silas's mare, who he had tied to the platform rail, just in case. She was not a victim. She was not a witness. She was a partner. She grabbed the reins, bunched Juniper's mane in her fist, and with a strength she did not know she possessed, she hauled herself into the saddle. She kicked her heels, and the mare, born for this, exploded into a gallop, hot on Silas's heels. The square of Copper Mesa erupted in a cloud of brown, choking dust. The world dissolved into chaos. The crack of Jasper's shot was followed by the whump of Silas's body hitting the chestnut's side, and then there was only the roar of the crowd, the thud of hooves, and the choking, brown cloud of dust. Jasper's black gelding, fresh and fast, had the lead. He tore through the edge of the square, scattering stray cattle and screaming onlookers, his eyes fixed on the open pass that led out of town. Silas was right behind him, the chestnut's powerful legs eating up the ground, his body low over the horse's neck. He was not a rancher. He was a hunter, and his quarry was in sight. Goldie was a beat behind them, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. Juniper, the mare Silas had taught her to ride, was faster and more nimble than Jasper's heavy gelding. She had sense. Goldie gave the mare her head, her own hands, calloused and sure, light on the reins. She was not thinking. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time, simply doing. The man in the brown hat? Jasper's hulking accomplice had recovered. He'd been at the edge of the square, and he saw his boss's escape. He spurred his own horse, a big, clumsy bay, not after Jasper, but cutting across the square, aiming to intercept Silas. He was yelling, his mouth a black hole in his bearded face. He never made it, a dark shape, moving with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown in Slocum's office. Emerged from the alley, Cole Brannan, mounted on his own cow pony, rode directly into the bay's path. The two men and horses collided with a sickening thud. The bay went down, and Cole was on the man in the brown hat before the dust settled, his fist rising and falling in a short, brutal rhythm. Goldie did not look back. The fight was ahead. Jasper was heading for Devil's Wash, a twisting, narrow canyon of red rock and shale, a place where a man could disappear. The clatter of the three horses echoed off the high rock walls, a frantic, metallic drumbeat. Jasper's horse was fast, but it was panicking, its head high, foam flying from its bit. Silas's chestnut was a machine, steady, powerful, and gaining. They entered the narrowest part of the wash, a place where the walls were only 10 feet apart. Jasper knew he was losing. He knew he was being run down. He looked back, his face a mask of purple rage and disbelief. He yanked his horse to a skidding halt, the animal screaming. He pulled the small, silver derringer from his boot. He did not aim for Silas. He aimed for the rock wall just above his head. He fired. The crack was deafening in the enclosed space. A sharp, violent explosion of sound. It was a sound designed to terror. A large, galloping horse, spooked by a sound it cannot see, will rear. Silas's chestnut, trained for the open range, was no exception. It shied, its front legs leaving the ground, its body twisting in the narrow space. It was the opening Jasper needed. He spurred his horse forward, into the pass, to make his escape. He did not count on Goldie. He did not count on the small mare with the heart of a lion. Goldie saw it all. She saw Jasper fire. She saw Silas's horse rear. And in that split second, she saw something else. To the left, a place where a rock slide had fallen years ago, was a narrow fissure, a goat path, barely 2 feet wide. That cut straight up the side of the shale. It was a shortcut, a dangerous one. She did not hesitate. She hauled Juniper's head to the left, kicking her hard. "Now, girl!" she yelled, her voice raw. The mare, with the agility of a cat, leaped. Her hooves found purchase on the loose rock. She scrambled, she dug, she climbed, her body working, her lungs pumping. Goldie leaned low, her face in the mare's flying mane. For 3 seconds, they were a part of the rock, and then they were at the top, 20 feet below. Jasper was just passing. Goldie spurred Juniper over the edge. The mare landed with a jolt that nearly unseated her, but she was down, on the path, right in front of him. Jasper hauled on his reins, his black gelding rearing, its eyes white with terror, nearly falling backward. He was trapped. Silas, who had already wrestled his own horse under control, was behind him, and in front of him, blocking the pass, was the woman he had left for dead. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with dust. The cheap blue dress was torn at the knee from the scramble. She was breathing hard, but she was not afraid. She sat the horse, her hand steady, her back straight. "Get out of my way, you fool!" Jasper screamed, his voice a hoarse, panicked shriek. His hand, shaking with rage, fumbled at his side, moving toward the larger, holstered gun on his belt. "Look at me, Jasper," Goldie said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was perfectly, frighteningly calm. It was a voice that cut through his panic, a voice he had never heard. "Look at me. I'm still alive." He stared at her, his mouth working. The mask was gone. The charm, the polish. It had all been sandblasted away, leaving only the weak, terrified man underneath. You're a ghost," he stammered. "No," she said. "I'm just a woman you underestimated. No one will believe you," he tried. One last pathetic bluff. He laughed, but the sound was a wet, choking noise. "You're hysterical, a runaway." "They don't have to believe me," Goldie said. Her hand went to her pocket, not for the pistol she did not have. She pulled out the heavy, silver brooch. "They just have to believe this." She threw it. It landed in the dust, right at his horse's feet. He stared at it, confused. My wedding gift," he sneered, his bravado returning for a fatal second. "The souvenir. What is that?" The brooch, its clasp weakened by weeks of Goldie's twisting, had landed hard. The fake ruby catch popped open. The tiny, tightly folded piece of paper, her father's map, her father's proof, spilled out. It unfurled in the dust, a small, white, undeniable truth. At that moment, Silas's chestnut slid to a halt, blocking the pass from behind. Jasper was boxed in. Silas dismounted, his own pistol in his hand, but held low, his arms straight. He saw the brooch. He saw the map. He saw the look on Jasper's face. "The motive," Silas said, his voice flat. He was not speaking to Jasper. He was speaking the truth into the air. "The proof of what you knew. The reason you had to have the land." He looked at Jasper, his eyes cold as the steel in his hand. "From the minute you left her in that desert, Jasper, you lit your own fuse." Jasper was cornered. His eyes darted from the calm woman in front of him to the hard man behind him. He was a rat. He made a rat's choice. He screamed, a high, thin sound, and his hand yanked at the holstered gun. He was not a gunman. He was clumsy. He was desperate. He was not fast enough. He was not even close. Silas did not shoot. He moved, covering the 5 feet between them in one long stride. He brought his left hand, the one that was not holding the gun, up in a hard, brutal arc. It was not a punch. It was a slap, the sound of his calloused, leather-tough palm striking Jasper's wrist. It was the sound of bone on bone. Jasper shrieked. The gun flew from his numb fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the rocks. The clatter was joined by the sound of more hooves. Deputy Amos Pike, his face bright red and sweating, rode into the wash, flanked by 2 townsfolk, ranchers with rifles across their laps. It's over, Doyle, Amos panted, pulling his own gun, his authority finally catching up. You are under detainment. Don't move. It was over. The two ranchers, their faces grim, pulled the sobbing, defeated man from his horse. He fought, but it was a weak, useless struggle. They bound his wrists. Hard. Goldie watched, her entire body shaking in the aftermath. The rage, the fear, it all drained away, leaving her hollow and cold. She slid off Juniper's back, her legs buckling. She caught herself on the mare's flank. She took a breath, and another. She straightened up. She walked, her steps sure past the men, past Jasper, who was now being tied, his face a ruin of sweat, dust, and hatred. She stopped. She turned back. He looked at her, his eyes wild. He spat. You ruined me. She looked at him, truly looked at him. No longer a monster, no longer a lover. Just a small, greedy, pathetic man. With not $1 to my name, she said, her voice quiet, but it carried. I still have my name, and I have the truth. That's more than you've ever had. She turned her back on him, for the last time. As she did, the sky, which had been a heavy, oppressive gray all day, finally broke. A sudden, cold, driving rain began to fall. It was not a drizzle, it was a deluge. It hissed on the hot rocks, turning the dust to immediate, dark mud. It washed the gunpowder from the air. It washed the sweat from her face. She looked at the ground, the small, white map. Her father's last gift was already a pulpy, dissolving mass. It did not matter. Its work was done. She watched as the ranchers tied Jasper's feet under his horse. She watched the mark his cuffed boots made in the new, wet mud as they dragged him away. It was a final, just signature. She looked up. Silas was standing 5 feet away. He had not moved. His hat was soaked, and the rain was running in streams down his hard, still face. He had holstered his gun. He was not looking at Jasper. He was looking at her. He did not smile. She did not smile, but she felt the last of the cold, the last of the fear that had been living in her bones for weeks. Just release. Her shoulders, which she had held braced for a fight, for a chase, for a lifetime, finally, fully, relaxed. He saw it. He saw the woman who had just survived a second desert, and this time had walked out on her own. He gave a single, slow, understanding nod. It was over, and it was all just beginning. The wind, now, was a friend. It came down from the high mesas, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the promise of coming winter. It was a few months later, and the brutal, copper-plate sun of summer was a memory. The land was healing, painted in the softer golds and ambers of a high desert autumn. The first, most visible change was at the gate to the ranch. The old, sun-bleached Thistle Ridge sign was still there, but a new, freshly cut plank hung below it. The letters burned deep and black into the wood. It read, Tate Crowell Cattle Copper Rights. The law, it turned out, moved slowly, but it moved with the weight of stone. Judge Beach, armed with Goldie's testimony, Jasper's forged document, and the confession of the man in the brown hat, who, it turned out, was named Hobbs and had no loyalty to a boss who couldn't pay him, had been thorough. The territorial court had nullified the fraudulent partnership. Jasper Doyle was in the territorial prison, facing a sentence of, as Nettie put it, 10 to 20 years of learning how to make smaller rocks out of big ones. Goldie's title to the Arroyo del Viento was absolute. Copper Mesa had changed, too. The rumor of copper, once a con man's lie, had been replaced by the fact of it. Goldie's claim, the shallow, rich vein her father had found, was real. It wasn't a river, as Jasper had lied, but it was a solid, profitable stream. Nettie LaRue, ever the opportunist, had knocked out the wall between her saloon and the empty harness shop next door. She opened the Morning Bell, a coffee and breakfast room that did not serve whiskey before noon. It was, she claimed, for a more civilized clientele. Her tables were now full every morning with the engineer delegation. A small, serious group of men from Denver hired by Goldie to assess and plan. The town was lively. The dust in the square now mixed with the sounds of new construction. But it had not lost its wind-blown soul. The truth, Judge Beach had said to Goldie, on the day the final papers were signed, is like the rain. Miss Tate. The judge had been on the courthouse steps. A rare moment of leisure. She'd offered Goldie a rare, thin smile. It doesn't care about your roof. It doesn't care about your plans. It just has its own way of finding the ground. I'm glad you were there to dig the channel. Goldie was no longer a guest. She was no longer a ranch hand. She was, to her own profound surprise, a partner. She spent her mornings not with the horses, but at the long kitchen table, which had become their office. She was learning to negotiate. She sat across from the Denver engineers, men with stiff collars and quick, appraising eyes. They spoke of percentages, of smelting costs, of water rights. At first, her voice had trembled. But she had Silas, sitting not beside her, but at the end of the table, his presence a silent anchor. He said little, but when he did, his words were practical, rooted in the land. That's a bad place to put a road, he'd say, looking at their maps. The wash will take it out every spring. Now, Goldie's voice did not tremble. She had signed a contract, not a sale, a lease, a sustainable mining agreement that gave her a 20% royalty on every pound of ore, and stipulated that the water from her creeks would not be poisoned. Her hands, the ones that had been raw and blistered, the ones that had shaken on the platform, now signed the paper with a steady, firm script. When she spoke to these men, she did not lower her eyes. The work of the ranch remained. The cattle were lowing, fat and ready for the winter market. The sky, this evening, was a deep, impossible shade of apricot, and the air was still. They rode back from the north pasture, side by side. Silas on his steady chestnut, Goldie on juniper. They were not in a hurry. They rode at a walk, their reins slack. It was a new rhythm they had found, a quiet, unspoken companionship that was as solid as the ground beneath them. Goldie's stirrup brushed her shoulder, in a wool jacket that was now her own, brushed his arm. It was a simple, accidental contact, and it sent a slow, familiar warmth through her. He looked over, his eyes, in the soft, dying light, losing their hard, watchful edge. He did not smile, not fully, but the lines at the corners of his eyes softened. It was his own language, and she had learned to read it. That night, the dishes were done, the ledgers put away. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting warm, moving shadows on the adobe walls. The house was quiet. Goldie was on the porch, the same porch where she had confessed her fear, the same porch where he had given her the world back with a single, patient kiss. She was looking out at the stars, which burned like cold, silver pinpricks in the black sky. She heard him come out. He brought the night's chill with him, but he also brought his own warmth. He stopped beside her. He held out his hand. Not for her to take. It was an invitation. "I don't hear any music," she said, her voice a low tease. "You're not listening," he replied. His voice was a rumble. She placed her hand in his. He did not pull her close. He simply led her, in a formal, old-fashioned gesture, to the center of the porch. He put one hand, calloused and sure, on the small of her back. She rested her other hand on his shoulder, and they danced. There was no music. There was only the sound of the wind in the high cottonwoods, the distant cry of a hunting owl, and the soft, rhythmic scuff of their boots on the wooden planks. It was a slow, swaying, one step. It was a dance of people who had been through the fire and had not been burned. It was not a dance of passion. It was a dance of gratitude. A quiet, moving thank you for survival, for partnership, for the steady, beating heart she could feel through his shirt. He held her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine soap and leather, a scent that was no longer just his, but the scent of home. When the dance, or the silence, ended, they did not move apart. He tilted his head down. She looked up. He did not need to ask. The kiss, this time, was not the desperate, healing kiss of that rainy night. This one was slow. It was deep. It was unhurried. It was a kiss of arrival. A kiss that said, "We are here." It was a kiss that held all the long, quiet days, the shared meals, the silent understanding. It was a kiss that held the promise of the future, a future that was not about running or fighting, but about building. It ended, but they stayed close. Goldie was too comfortable to move. She tipped her head, resting her forehead on the hard, solid line of his jaw. He was freshly shaven, and his skin was cool. She smiled, a slow, quiet smile that was not just on her lips, but in her chest, in her shoulders, in her whole body. He felt the change, the complete, settled peace in her. He covered her hand with his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. She closed her eyes, listening to the crickets, to the sound of a calf calling for its mother in the dark corral. The air was cold, but she was entirely, profoundly warm. "When you rode up at sunset," she whispered, the words against his skin. "That first day, in the desert, I thought I was just being saved. I thought you were just saving my life." She pulled her head back, just enough to look at him, her eyes clear in the starlight. "I was wrong," she said. "You were giving me one. You were giving me a life to love and a name to reclaim." Far in the distance, the lights of Copper Mesa, now brighter than before, twinkled, closer, in the dark. A foe whinnied. The story of Jasper Doyle, the story of the theft, was over. But this story, the one of Tate Crowell, was just beginning. And the horizon, out here, was still very, very long. And the rumor from the east, carried on the same wind, was that a new, even bigger railroad, the Transcontinental, was sending surveyors south. And their promises, unlike Jasper's, were always backed by straight-driven spikes and a much harder kind of law. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We're a new channel, and it means the world to have you here. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to chat and share our thoughts with you. Please, if you enjoyed this ride, subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and give this video a like. And if you really want to support us, hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.